All right. Well, welcome to this, our seventh podcast as we continue to look at Numbers and Deuteronomy this week. Hope that you all are continuing to move along with the reading and are finding it to be enlightening. I know I've heard from some folks about how much they enjoy these podcasts, and we really appreciate that. I want to remind you about the sermon series and the Sunday school class and TGIW class. Dan, how's the TGIW class going?
It's going very well. We have about 16, 17 people that are attending and having really good discussions basing on the sermons and then other scriptures that people took either questions or just meant something to them through that. So it's been going really well.
Good. Well, as we turn to Numbers this week, I know that we come upon one of the great challenges of reading through the Old Testament, and that is the place of war. And how do we understand some of the parts of the scriptures that speak to it? I think particularly of chapter 31, where it begins by saying, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, avenge the Israelite people on the Midianites, then you shall be gathered to your kin. Goes on, God tells the Israelites to kill all the Midianites, gets angry at them because they spared the women. And you know, that's a struggle for us as we think about the idea of God being compassionate and slow to anger, forgiving to the 10th generation. We think of Jesus as our example and his kindness. How do we understand the presence of violence and war in the Old Testament? And oddly enough, I want to focus us in this conversation back in chapter 22 of Numbers. As you look at chapter 22, we read the story of Balak and Balaam. Balak seeks out the prophet Balaam to curse the people of Israel. And Balaam continues to say throughout the story, I will say whatever the Lord instructs me to say. I will say whatever the Lord instructs me to say. He will only speak what the Lord tells him to speak. He only goes where the Lord tells him to go. He only does what the Lord tells him to do. We have the famous story of Balaam and his donkey. The donkey likewise only doing what God wants done. And we read that story and we resonate with this notion of doing only what the Lord wants us to do, only responding with obedience to the Almighty. And it seems to me that if that is our vision, the question then comes, how do we, in light of that, understand any violence? Because there is violence. There are times that our nation, the United States, has gone to war. I think of World War II, for instance. Feel like we were sort of on the side of the angels in that particular conflict. There have been other occasions, whether the Civil War or more recently the conflicts with Iraq and Afghanistan that are a little bit more complicated, or World War I, the Spanish-American War. There's a lot of war. So the question then comes, how do we deal with that? What do we do? There are those that say all war is contrary to Christian teaching, and I can understand that. I have a little trouble, again, as I said, particularly with World War II. What do we do with an Adolf Hitler if you can never go to war? There are others that say God causes war and God demands war. Well, if that's the case, then what do we do with Jesus's teaching to turn the other cheek? I don't have a really easy answer to this. As I have said previously, I didn't go to Duke Divinity, so perhaps they gave a better answer than my seminary.
No.
But it seems to me that what the scriptures tell us is that there is war, and God works within the brokenness of life as it is.
Yeah. And I think even in words, as it says, and I don't remember what scripture exactly is, but it does say in there will always be war. And it's a matter of realizing how I go about it. And for me, how I reconcile seeing a lot of this is most of these wars happen because they were cities or people who were leading people away from God. In a lot of these instances, they would do it because people, if they got involved, the people started worshiping other gods. And so, God's instructions were to the people like, don't do this or don't follow these people because we don't want you to lead astray. And while it doesn't help that, we feel like sometimes you feel like, well, innocent people are done. But a lot of times in this case, the people weren't innocent. It was just like they were leading people and worshiping other gods. And as we hear and read, it says God, God is a jealous God. God is a zealous God. Like he wants our obedience. And part of that a lot of this happened is because these other cities, countries, were not obedient to God's ways. They were obedient to these other gods and worshiping other gods. And that's what God didn't want the Israelites to do. He just pulled them out of Egypt for that because they were doing other false gods there. And then we just saw how, Aaron, even at the point when we talked about the 10 Commandments before, how he built the golden calf because people, they wanted something physical to worship. And it's a matter of getting the Israelites to trust and obey God. And yes, things were destroyed, people were at war. But for me, it was, and I don't want to say it's easy to justify because it's not. It's not easy to justify. The only thing I could go with was many of these cities were not worshiping God.
I think that I hear you and can certainly live with that in the context of Scripture. I think in the modern world that becomes very troubling and difficult as we begin to, pardon me for using the phrase that you used, justify ourselves to say we're the good guys. There's a fabulous little short story by Mark Twain that tells of a mythical country getting ready to go to war. And they're getting ready to send their children off to war. And they gather for prayer and pray for God to protect their children and to honor them. And it's called The War Prayer by Mark Twain. And in the course of it, an angel appears to the gathered company and says, "Okay, I will grant your prayer, but only after I tell you what it means. If I protect your children, if I give aid to your side, that means this group of people are going to die." And that's the challenge. That's the challenge always when we deal with war and violence. Are we sure we're on the right side?
It's a good question. And it's even hard to think that even with today, because a lot of times we have our very own Christian life are on two different sides in today's world, and trying to say, well, who's right? If we both believe in a God, but half of Christianity believes this way and another half of believes another way. How do we go about that as well? yeah, it's not easy by any means to do all this and to go through this. It's because these are things that God clearly said and instructed them to do. And it's a matter of, you know, we have to believe and trust that God knew what was best for his people at this time. Just it's hard. It's really hard. It's hard to justify it. Hard to reconcile.
It is. And, I think that one of the things that I would say is that it's an opportunity for us to discuss what is the purpose of the church. There are some that say that the purpose of the church is to answer all of life's tough questions. I prefer the definition of the church as a place to hold life's tough questions. I don't think we have to have an answer about, is war ever okay? Is war always okay? It doesn't have to be black and white. And it doesn't have to be God always commands war, God never commands war. The church needs to be a place where we wrestle earnestly to hear a word from God about the difficult decisions of life, about the challenges that surround us every day.
It's a good word. I agree.
Well, moving on, I do think that there are obviously quite a number of wonderful stories in this book of Numbers. In the midst of all of the counting that happens in Numbers, there are some meaningful stories. In chapter 27, we come across the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. Say that 3 times fast, and understand the compassion that is in there. In the ancient world, it was sons that mattered. It was sons that it inherited. It was sons that continued the family. And Zelophehad had only daughters, 3 daughters, and they were in danger of losing their place, losing their inheritance. And they came to Moses and Aaron and pleaded for an inheritance. And the pattern was changed. It was said in chapter 27, it says, if a man dies without leaving a son, you shall transfer his property to his daughter. If he has no daughter, you shall assign his property to his brothers to continue this this place of inheritance. I think it's worth seeing that God responds to the needs of the people as things change over the course of things.
Yeah, and it's nice to see, because in this time women didn't really have voice or even any kind of I don't want to say respect, but sort of respect in the community. They were always in the lower part of the standards in there, and so to see this happen there, it was big, and to see that you could even see in this time frame, women began to have the rights and be noticed as these are important people, and their voice began to be heard where it wasn't before, and to see that they were able to receive what literally was rightful in their family is something to see and remember even today. Things going on in our world, a lot of people like to go back and don't give the people that they feel are less of value. They don't like to give them those equal rights, and so it's nice to see, even in biblical times, there was equality made, and they were included in things that many would not have included women in at all.
Well, I think that it's important to see that the scriptures themselves, as I think I mentioned in one of the previous podcasts, the scriptures themselves seem to have what our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters call a preferential option for the poor, that God tends always to be listening for that voice of the outcast, the voice of the outsider. You know, again and again in our readings through Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and even up into Deuteronomy, we hear God speaking to say, if you oppress your neighbors, I will hear their cry. I will hear the cry of the oppressed. And I think for those of us that, whether we acknowledge it or not, those of us who have a measure of power need to acknowledge that and need to be aware of it. We in this country and in our congregation, our community, have a lot of choices, and they can impact, the choices that we make can impact a lot of people. That's power. That's power. And we need to be aware of that.
Absolutely.
Which in a way is a good segue as we move into Deuteronomy this week, and we begin to hear this final word from Moses before his departure. And there are a couple of things that really stand out to me. One of which is the version of the Ten Commandments that is in Deuteronomy, particularly around the Sabbath. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, beginning with verse 12, it speaks of observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. And then goes on in verse 15 to say, remember, you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath. In Deuteronomy, this practice of the Sabbath is ground in some measure of, for lack of a better term, economic and social justice. In Exodus, the Sabbath is ground in the very story of creation. Both are present in the practice of Sabbath, and we just hear a slightly different word here.
Yeah. And it is. I mean, it's one of those things that it's almost like a reminder of Sabbath as a redemption in a way, because it's almost like a reminder, like, this is what God redeemed you. He rescued you out of Egypt. And when I was reading this and going through this in my head, that's what I was reminded of. I was reminded of he's listing this time of Sabbath as the time how God redeemed them and rescued them, and how that is an important, when I think of it in our own lives, how that's what Sabbath should be for us, a time where we can be redeemed and rescued from the busyness of the world, to take time and remember what God truly means for us as well.
You know, there's always a great struggle, at least in my ministry, as I've talked to folks about the Sabbath. There's a struggle around the place of what used to be known as the blue laws in the South. There was a season where stores were not open and restaurants were not open on Sundays. And, you know, we can debate whether or not the Sabbath is Saturday or Sunday. Right. But that's a different debate to be had. And whether or not there should or shouldn't be restaurants that are open and stores that are open. I tend, for myself, first of all, I do go out to lunch on Sundays, not often, but occasionally. We go out to lunch. Need to admit that. And there's a part of me that tends to think that maybe that's not a good idea. Because if I'm in a restaurant on Sunday, then a waiter or a waitress has to be in a restaurant on a Sunday, and a busboy needs to be in a restaurant on a Sunday, and a cook, and about 16 other folks, just so that I can have my meal. And the question is, when is their Sabbath?
Mm-hmm.
When is their Sabbath? Do we all need to have the same Sabbath? And am I forcing them to work so that I can be
Have your
comfortable?
peace, yeah. Well, and it reminded me a lot because, I mean, even growing up in Pennsylvania, I mean, we had the same with blue laws and things not open. But when we came home from church, it was always family. We were always at my grandparents, and we would get together and we had a meal together and family time, and that's how we spent time. Our families were just spent more time together then, because you couldn't do anything else. There was nothing else. I mean, you couldn't go anywhere. Nothing was open. So we came home, went to my grandparents, had dinner, and spent the afternoon,
Watching the Steelers.
playing football. That's right. Watching football games or playing cards or board games or whatever it was. But there was, when football season was over, there was just, you had to occupy that time doing something. And I just remember those, every time we'd come home from church, family went together to my grandparents. We had meals, like I said, either watched games or sat around and played games, or some just sat around and slept, whatever it was. It was a time where people were together, though. And there's times when I miss those days, the time when the family actually spent time together. And now with everything being open, I think that causes a lot of interruptions in families' life, not only with things being open, but there's even other, sports things that are keeping families away from church. That, they're playing soccer, they're playing basketball, they're in a travel league, they're doing whatever the situation is. There's so much things competing for people's times that I just think not everybody has the chance to do that. Of course, it's a choice you're making. That's the big thing, is the choice that you're making is not to take that Sabbath, and you're choosing to do and that's exactly what God didn't want us to do, because those people had a choice even back then, not to do this, but God was saying, no, this is I'm God. Obey the Sabbath, keep it holy, do these things, and so it's the choice that people are making of how to do it.
Yeah, I think the choice is a key thing. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus gives a standard where he says some are eunuchs from birth, some are made eunuchs by others, and some are eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God. And I think that the standard that he is saying is that some people are forced not to work. During the blue laws, there were some that were forced not to work, and there were some that now, to not go to a restaurant or to not go to the store on the Sabbath, on whatever you name as your Sabbath, is a choice.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, as we draw to a close for today, there were two other things that I did want to point out in Deuteronomy. First, in chapter 7, verses 7 and 8, God says, it's not because you are the most numerous of peoples that the Lord set his heart on you and chose you. Indeed, you are the smallest of peoples. But it was because the Lord favored you and kept the oath he made to your fathers, that the Lord freed you with a mighty hand and rescued you from the house of bondage, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. We hear a lot about this notion of the people of Israel as the chosen people. And there is a tendency for all of us, whether Christian or Jewish or otherwise, to think that we are special because God has chosen us. And this is a reminder, I think, that grace is grace precisely because we didn't do anything special. We're not all that wonderful. Grace is grace because God gives it.
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, and that's the beauty of it. You know, it's a free gift offered to us with no price to us, but of a price to Jesus, who gave us that ultimate gift. I mean, without that, where would we be today? And how would we be able to get through situations? I mean, it's just a great opportunity, a great gift, knowing that we really didn't have to do anything at all for it.
Exactly. Exactly.
And that's the beauty of it.
And lastly, I did want to point out Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, particularly. One of the only phrases that verse 4 is pretty much the only phrase that I can come close to saying in Hebrew. I may well mispronounce it. But in Hebrew, verse 4 is Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Ahot. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Mm-hmm. That phrasing stands iconically in the faith of our Jewish cousins, and the phrasing verses 4 and 5. As it says, as you continue, take to heart these instructions with which I charge you this day. Impress them on your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. It is verses 4 and 5 that are written in a scroll that in very Orthodox Jewish households get nailed to the doorposts for a mitzvah and get reminded again and again.
Yes, it's a great way to close, a great way to reminder, a great piece to reminder that Jesus said these very words. And added to it, but when we think the importance of like they call it the Shema, it's saying this. These are things that they reported, and I think we said it was twice a day they had to say it, and so to remember that God, that He loves you, and for us to love the Lord with all our heart and with all our might and with all our strength, are important words. Weren't just for us, but even for our Jewish ancestors, and through that, and how that sticks to us today is a good way, I think, of, as we're going through these scriptures, reminding what is most important.
And reminding, I think for me, one of the great comforts to me is the sense that God has been in this business of walking with people for millennia upon millennia. And God is still at work in our world. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we get overwhelmed by the things that are happening around us and I need to remind myself, and I think all of us do, that God's still working. Mm-hmm. God's still moving. It's not done yet. The story's not done.
Right. Thank goodness. We got to.
Well, that's where we'll end for today, and look forward to talking again next week.